Now, in the last few lessons, we learned about what it's like to make queries against this GraphQL server that I've made for you. You've seen what type of queries you have available, as well as what kind of data you're able to fetch. But how do we actually bring this into our application? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do in the subsequent lessons from this lesson forward. The first thing I want to point you towards is this GitHub repo. So this repo actually contains the code that we're going to use to start from. This will be our starting point. So inside of your resources, just go to this URL, and I want you to clone down this repository. Now, this repository is going to be very similar to the same repository that you used before the Context API lesson. The Context API lesson mainly had one difference, which I will show you. And it's simply one new component that I added in here. Other than that, it's the exact same repo as the one you saw when you did the Context API lessons. I've removed the Redux saga, and I've removed the CSS and JS. The main reasons I did that is just because what we're going to do is we're actually going to leverage the library that we're going to use to interact with our GraphQL server to handle our local state. It's going to solve all of the problems in its own way that Redux and Context API solve. The only difference is that here it leverages this GraphQL interface that we're going to see. So if that sounds a little bit weird, it is going to be a little bit different, but I promise you that by the end of it, you'll be convinced as to why it's a great service. So again, click that clone button, copy that link, and let's go back to our terminal. Now go to the folder that you want to clone it into. Make sure it's not another project folder, and just run git clone and then paste that key in. Now you can name it anything you want. I'm going to name it GraphQL Crown Clothing. Oops, GraphQL, not WL. And we're going to clone into it. So let's just cd into our new GraphQL project and just open up this project and let me show you what new component it is that I've added. So if you go into the source and you go into components, you'll see that there's this new spinner component. Now, this spinner component is just the spinner component that was inside of our with spinner higher order component that we've been using to handle our loader states. The only difference here is that I've simply removed away all of the higher order component side of it and just exposed the base spinner component itself. That's all it is. It's pretty much just two divs with some styling on it. That's all it is. Now, that's pretty much the only difference. And the reason why we're going to see that I made this new component is because the library that we're going to use to integrate our React application so that it can work with GraphQL is this library called Apollo Client. Now, Apollo is a great library with a great team behind it that has built all of these features that make our lives much easier when it comes to working with GraphQL. Because GraphQL is still a pretty new technology, so there is parts of it that are going to be really different. But I promise you that by the end of it, you guys will understand how to work with it because the benefits are worth the slight complexity that it will bring. But let's first bring in this library and we'll talk more about what it can do for us as we build out our code. So we'll go back to your terminal. And what you're going to include is you're going to include three packages. You're going to run yarn add and you're going to say Apollo boost. So with one P and two L's. You're going to say React Apollo. And you're also going to say GraphQL. So make sure there's no dash between the graph and the QL. We're going to include these three libraries. And then we're going to run yarn again so that we make sure that we also include all of the other dependency in our project. So while this is being done, let me talk a little bit about the Apollo client. Now, one of the big things that is great about Apollo is that when we query for things from our GraphQL server, this client will make sure to cache the data that we've fetched. So let's say we fetch our collections data. If we navigate back to our page and the request makes a new query against our GraphQL for those collections again, if none of the data has changed, then GraphQL is not going to make the request. It's simply just going to give us back the cached version of the code that it has, because that way it doesn't actually have to make an extra request, especially if nothing's changed. The other great thing is that if we use those items anywhere else inside of our application from that main fetch, so let's say we fetched all our collections, anywhere where we use the one singular collection, we will not have to refetch it from our database because we already have a version of it cached on our front end. So that's really good. And the client helps manage that data. Now, let's actually work with it and we'll see more of what the benefits are. Now, I know what I said might seem also a little confusing, but we'll definitely see it when we start working with it. First thing that we need to do is we need to go into our index.js because we need to instantiate the client itself. The client being the Apollo client. So we're going to import in a couple libraries. The first thing we're going to bring in is the Apollo provider from React Apollo. Now, this is very similar to the providers that we've already seen from both Redux as well as the providers that we wrote ourselves in the Context API. It just allows the rest of our application to be able to access the state that is stored on Apollo. The other thing we're going to need is this thing called create HTTP link from Apollo link HTTP. Now, this thing is what is going to let us actually connect our client to our specific endpoint that I was telling you about. So in our backend server, it exposes one endpoint that we make all our queries against. And this HTTP link is what we're going to use to establish that connection. Next, you're going to import in this thing called in-memory cache from Apollo cache in-memory. In-memory. Can't spell today. And this is the thing that Apollo uses to actually cache the data that it fetches that I was telling you about, so that it doesn't double cache, it doesn't make double requests, right? And it tries to be as optimal as it can about making requests and then keeping the data. And finally, we're going to import in the Apollo client itself. And this is going to be from this library, Apollo Boost. Now, while it's true that we only installed 3 libraries, if you remember, we installed React Apollo, Apollo Boost, and GraphQL. Well, GraphQL is a dependency that these 2 libraries depend on, and Apollo Boost is actually a bundle of smaller libraries that the Apollo team has built that makes it easier for us, including the link HTTP and the Apollo cache in memory. So what we installed when we installed Apollo Boost was a bunch of smaller libraries that give us a bunch of different functionalities that make our lives easier. So we're actually going to use them and see how they help us set up our client. So what we're going to do is we are going to first establish the connection to our backend. So we're going to say const HTTP link is equal to create HTTP link. And this is a function that takes an object as the argument. The object's argument is going to be URI. And that property's value is going to be https://crownclothing.com. And that's all it is. This is pretty much that link that we were playing against in our playground. It's also the same link that actually represents our endpoint that I exposed to you for you to use against. So once you have your HTTP link, we are going to also create our cache. So our cache is going to be a new object, which we call on our new in-memory cache, which is a class. And this cache object is something that we're actually going to use to manage our data. So you can kind of see it similar to a top-level reducer. It's kind of like just an object that we use as local storage for our application. After that, what we're going to do is actually make the client. So to do that, we're going to say const client equals new Apollo client, and we're going to pass into it an object. And this object is going to take the properties of link going to our new HTTP link. So now it knows what to request to. And then we're also going to say the cache goes to the cache. So because it's already named cache, we can just use this shorthand, which will set cache to our cache. And that's our client. Now we just got to make sure to pass it into our Apollo provider, which will wrap our application and then give our application access to the context of the data that is stored inside of Apollo, as well as allow us to actually make requests with Apollo. So we're going to say Apollo provider. And inside is a property called client that we pass the client. And now we've hooked it up. But we can actually test the client before anything else, just to make sure that it's all working. So let's actually make a request. The first thing we're going to do is we're also going to import this thing called GQL, which is a function from Apollo Boost. Now, as you remember, the shape that we're requesting for our data actually looks different from a JSON. So we actually have to have something that understands what this is. So let's just go back to our application, and we're going to make a request with the client itself. We're going to say client.query. So on the client, there's actually both the mutation and the query parameters that we can use in order to make either a request for data or a request to update data. We're just going to use the query key. And it's a method that takes an object. And this object is going to need the same structure of the key that we sent into our backend. So if you remember, we sent in query first, right? So we'll say query, which goes to, and then here is where we're going to use that GQL tag. So we're going to say it's going to be a GQL object, right? And by wrapping it in GQL, now we can type those GraphQL bindings that we had that we saw that look like a JSON object. So we're going to have those braces. And we're literally pretty much just going to copy in whatever it was that's here. So we can even just use this one, in fact, right? And now what the query returns us back is a promise. And the promise will resolve to the data if it managed to fetch us this data successfully. So we're just going to say .then with the response, and we're just going to console log the response. And that's pretty much it. If we go back to our application now, we see that we got it back. We see that we got back this object, and on the data with that query name that we saw when we made the request ourselves as well, we have our object with our ID and the items on it. So this is pretty much how we use the client in order to make requests. And it's actually really easy to use if we were to manually just use the client. But this library, this Apollo Boost library, actually takes it a step further, and it gives us access to components that will handle loading and error states for us, which is why, again, we had our spinner component added into this project. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to leverage this new Apollo client to make requests for the collections and then actually populate some of our components with that data. So we'll do that in the next lesson.